The bankers who loved art. The big question: what motivated Renaissance patrons to commission so much art? The Medici family of Florence was incredibly wealthy. You have already heard some stories about Lorenzo de' Medici and the artists he supported. Let's first learn more about Lorenzo's grandfather, Cosimo, who really established the family as patrons of great art. By the mid-1400s, Cosimo de' Medici had built a thriving international banking business, taking advantage of the success of Italian merchants trading goods with other countries. Bankers would charge fees to exchange foreign money for local money and to provide loans to customers. He and his family made the city of Florence the banking center of Europe. Like his ancestors, Cosimo was a shrewd businessman. However, something else also captured his interest. Cosimo had grown up surrounded by the ruins of the Roman Empire. As a child, he had looked at the crumbling buildings and wondered, who were these Romans? What can I learn from them? As an adult, Cosimo collected rare books and manuscripts. He hired scribes to copy and translate them. He made sure his own children read great works by the Roman poet Virgil and the Greek philosopher Plato. He built libraries. Who's really in charge? Cosimo de' Medici was a great patron of the arts. The Medici family home became a gathering place for thinkers and artists from around the world. Many artists lived with Cosimo as they worked on their statues and paintings. One idea from the ancient Greeks really appealed to Cosimo de' Medici. This was the idea of democracy, rule by the people. Cosimo liked the idea of creating a new society in Florence modeled on Greek ideas. But for Cosimo, democracy was only an idea. In reality, the city of Florence was not run in a democratic way because Cosimo controlled Florence. Here's the way democracy was supposed to work in Florence. The craftsmen and merchants of Florence joined together in special groups called guilds, such as the Wool Merchants Guild, the Silk Weavers Guild, and the Doctors and Pharmacists Guild. The guild members elected councilmen, and these councilmen were supposed to govern the city. That was a step toward democracy, but it was Cosimo who told the guild members which councilmen to elect. These men were friends of his who followed his suggestions closely. By this method, Cosimo de' Medici indirectly ruled Florence for 30 years. The citizens of Florence liked Cosimo well enough that they did not protest his way of ruling the city. After all, Cosimo successfully protected the city from its enemies. He made generous gifts to charity. Business in Florence was booming. When Cosimo de' Medici died at the age of 76, the grateful people of Florence gave him the title Father of Our Country. Like father, not like son. After Cosimo's death, his son Piero took charge of Florence. Piero suffered from gout, a painful disease of the joints, and had to be carried from place to place on a stretcher. Piero did not inherit his father's leadership or banking skills, but he did love art. Frail Piero ruled only a few years before he died. Piero's son Lorenzo became ruler of Florence when he was only 20 years old. Lively, dashing, and popular, Lorenzo was the opposite of his sickly father. He played sports, wrote songs, and loved to discuss poetry and philosophy. Lorenzo enjoyed the good life so much that when his father died, he hesitated to take charge of Florence. He soon realized, however, that in Florence, if you weren't in charge, you wouldn't stay wealthy. His peacemaking skills won the hearts of his countrymen and the respect of other leaders in Europe. People began to call him Lorenzo the Magnificent. Patron and poet. Like his father and grandfather, Lorenzo loved classical literature and art. He wrote poetry. The Platonic Academy, a group of learned scholars, continued to meet at his house. He carried on the family tradition of supporting many painters and sculptors and filling his home with beautiful works of art. Lorenzo started the School of Sculpture, where the great Michelangelo trained as a young boy. And as you have discovered, Lorenzo was a patron of and friend to Michelangelo. He also supported such great Renaissance artists as Botticelli and Verrocchio, the master from Leonardo's days as an apprentice. Severe Savonarola. Lorenzo had ruled Florence for about 10 years when the monk named Savonarola came to the city. Little did Lorenzo know the trouble this man would bring. You have already heard about how Savonarola's harsh sermons prompted Botticelli to change his style of painting. As soon as Savonarola arrived in town, he began preaching against the Medici family. He said they ate too much, drank too much, dressed immodestly, and cared too much about their fancy belongings. He made the same charges against the people of Florence. Lorenzo tried to make peace with Savonarola by giving a donation to the monastery where the monk lived. Savonarola returned the money with an insult. He said a good monk is like a good watchdog. When a thief comes along and throws him a bone, he puts it to one side and goes on barking. The end of the Medici family. In 1492 CE, Lorenzo died at the age of 43, leaving his 21-year-old son Piero in charge. This Piero was known as Piero the Unfortunate, because of his poor judgment and complete lack of political knowledge. 2 years later, the French invaded Florence, and Piero was forced to leave the city. Angry mobs broke into the Medici family home and tore it to pieces, destroying or selling off many valuable items. After Piero's departure, Savonarola took charge of the city for a while. He had a grand plan to turn Florence into a model city of Christian virtue. But his expectations were too high and his rules were too strict. For example, he sent out bands of men who patrolled the streets and carried sticks to beat anyone whose clothing they thought was too fancy. Although Savonarola's message was harsh, many people listened to him. Once, he urged his followers to build a huge bonfire in the town square. He told the people of Florence to throw in their vanities, the things he considered fancy and unnecessary. Men and women tossed jewelry and expensive clothing, even paintings and books into the roaring blaze, which is remembered as the bonfire of the vanities. Although Savonarola was a monk, he openly insulted the powerful leader of the church, the Pope. He said that Pope Alexander VI was corrupt. At first, the Pope ordered Savonarola to stop giving sermons. This didn't quiet the angry monk. Later, the Pope excommunicated Savonarola, which means he took away his membership of the church. Then Savonarola was accused of the crime of heresy, of holding beliefs that disagreed with the church. Back then, the church was very powerful and demanded that people follow its rules. It was a serious crime to be a heretic. Eventually, Savonarola angered the church so much that he was arrested, convicted, and executed. From Florence to Rome. The main activity of the Renaissance now moved from Florence to Rome. Rome was the headquarters of the church and home to the Pope. From 1450 CE on, one pope after another took on the role of patron of the arts. Like the wealthy businessmen of Florence, the popes in Rome supported artists in their work. Why? Pope Nicholas V said that when people saw the spectacular works of art created with the church's support, they would better appreciate the magnificence and power of the church. The popes called many artists to Rome and set them to work on some of the most beautiful paintings, sculptures, and buildings of all time. Rome replaced Florence as the cultural center of the Renaissance. The Vatican and St. Peter's today. The Pope lives in the Vatican, a short name used for the Palace of the Vatican. This huge building contains the official home of the Pope, as well as many museums, chapels, church offices, and a library. It is located in what is now called Vatican City. Vatican City used to be part of Rome, but now it's a separate country. That's right. Vatican City is a country. In fact, it's the smallest independent country in the world. One of the most important buildings in Vatican City is St. Peter's Basilica, which was designed and built mostly during the Renaissance. Venice, the floating city. The Republic of Venice, a great trading center of the Renaissance, was a city-state north of Florence and Rome. Venice is perched on the Adriatic Sea between Europe and Asia. In the Middle Ages, the merchants of Venice were trading in Constantinople and as far away as China. The Venetians loaded their ships with silver, wine, and woolen cloth from Europe, as well as fine glassware produced in Venice, to trade with merchants to the east. They returned with silk and porcelain from China, or spices from the East Indies. By the 1400s, Venice was known for more than just trading. It had built a fleet of ships and won battles to take over neighboring city-states. Venice became very wealthy and powerful. During the Renaissance, wealthy Venetians not only supported many artists, they also built a city that is a work of art. Venice is a city on the water, not just near, but on the water. The city rests on more than 100 small islands. To connect many of the islands, the Venetians built bridges as well as a maze of narrow waterways. These waterways, called canals, crisscrossed the city and made it possible to get from one little island to another. The most famous of the canals, the Grand Canal, winds through the city for about 2 miles. Even today, people travel on the canals in long, sleek, flat-bottomed boats called gondolas. At the heart of the city's life was the huge open area called St. Mark's Square, where thousands of pigeons flock before the doors of the magnificent church called St. Mark's Basilica. The master of color. Titian was considered to be the greatest Venetian artist of the 1500s. He is perhaps best known for his use of vibrant color. Titian's portraits reveal his ability to capture his subjects' personalities. As well as people, his paintings often contain mythological and religious themes.